organization hired us to figure out why their digital transformation was stalling. They had run an engagement survey 3 months earlier. Support for the initiative was at 82%. Leadership was baffled. If 4 out of 5 people supported the transformation, why wasn't anything actually changing? So we started measuring something different. Not what people said they would do, but what they actually did. We tracked systems logins, feature usage, time spent in new workflows versus the old workarounds. We even monitored question frequency in training sessions, as well as error reporting rates. We looked at whether people were helping their colleagues learn the new system or quietly reverting to spreadsheets when no one was watching. The behavioral data told a completely different story than the survey. Actual adoption was 31%. 2 out of 3 people who claimed to support the transformation were actively avoiding it in their daily work. They weren't lying on the survey. They genuinely believed they supported the initiative, but their behavior revealed what their conscious minds couldn't admit. They weren't psychologically ready for change. This gap between stated support and actual behavior is the measurement crisis that is at the heart of transformation failure. And it's why everything that we've discussed in the first 9 episodes of this series, from resistance patterns to transformation fatigue, remains invisible to most organizations until it's far too late. I'm Kevin Novak, CEO of 2040 Digital, professor at the University of Maryland, and author of the book, The Truth About Transformation, Leading in the Age of AI, Uncertainty, and Human Complexity, as well as the Ideas and Innovations weekly newsletter. Welcome to the Human Factor Podcast, the show that explores the intersection of humanity, technology, and transformation, along with the psychology behind transformation success. Today, we're exploring how to measure the human factor, the psychological readiness that determines whether your transformation will succeed or become another casualty of the 70% failure rate. This connects directly to the subtitle of my book, Leading in the Age of AI, Uncertainty, and Human Complexity, because in an era where technology changes faster than psychology can adapt, understanding how to measure what's actually happening inside your organization, not what surveys tell you is happening, becomes the difference between transformation success and complete or expensive failure. Here's the fundamental problem with how organizations measure transformation. We measure what people say instead of what they do. We ask people if they support the change, and we're surprised when stated support doesn't translate to behavioral change. We track training completion rates, and we assume that completing a course means someone has actually changed how they work. We count system logins, and we conclude that access frequency equals adoption. These aren't measurements of human factors. They're measurements of compliance theater. And they explain why organizations keep investing in transformations that fail at 70% predictable rates, despite all the dashboards showing them green. Today, I'm going to share the measurement framework we developed at 2040 Digital to make psychological readiness visible and actionable for our clients. First, I want to share that if I sound a bit different this week, I had sinus surgery last week, so I'm in active recovery. I wanted to do this episode because this is a topic that I'm incredibly passionate about. So let's start by understanding why the metrics you're currently using are probably lying to you. Research from implementation science reveals a consistent pattern across industries and transformation types. Self-reported support for organizational change typically ranges between 70 and 85%. People genuinely believe they support the initiative, but actual adoption rates measured by sustained behavioral change rather than survey responses averages between 30 and 45%. That's a gap of 40 to 50% percentage points between what people say and what they do. And here's the critical insight. This isn't a communication problem or a training gap. It's a measurement problem. We're measuring the wrong things, and then we're surprised when first surveys measure intention, not behavior. When someone says they support a transformation, they're reporting their conscious intention. They genuinely believe they support it. But intention and behavior are governed by different psychological systems. Your conscious mind can commit to change while your unconscious mind is working overtime to protect you from it. This is exactly what we explored in episode 8 on hidden resistance. The quality director, who sincerely supports digital transformation, still raises quality concerns that delay implementation. She wasn't lying. She's protecting herself from competence threat in ways that she can't consciously recognize. Surveys also nearly always drive the respondents to answers expected by the survey creators. Whether an individual or a group of authors create the survey, they are developing the questions. Then they often, to gain consistency of response, develop the multiple choice answers. That survey construction leads the respondents to choose from what was provided. In my consulting experience all these years, it rarely have I seen the truth result from surveys. Those hidden gems of challenges, resistance, of important knowledge only present themselves outside of a survey construct. And only then can one recognize the very human behaviors that are manifesting and causing problems with the project. Second, training metrics measure compliance, not capability. When organizations track training completion rates or training test scores, they're measuring whether people showed up, not whether they retained information, and if they will put that knowledge into action, and not whether they embrace the change. The research on training transfer, the extent to which skills learned in training actually appear in job performance, is sobering. Studies consistently show that only 10 to 20% of training content translates to sustained behavior change on the job. Yet, organizations continue to use training completion as a proxy for transformation readiness. Third, usage metrics measure frequency of access, not adoption. System logins, feature clicks, and time in application are all proxies for adoption, not evidence of it. Someone can log into a new system every day and still be doing their actual work in Excel spreadsheets. They've learned the minimum necessary to appear compliant while maintaining their comfortable workflows. This is one of the most common patterns we see in digital transformation. The dashboard shows 90% usage. The reality is maybe 40% of the people have genuinely changed how they work. Fourth, milestone metrics measure project progress, not psychological readiness. Traditional transformation scorecards track implementation milestones, technology deployed, training delivered, processes documented. These are important operational metrics, of course, but they tell you nothing about whether people are psychologically prepared to work differently. You can achieve every milestone and still fail the transformation because the human factors simply weren't ready. The fundamental problem is that we're measuring visible activities and assuming they reflect invisible psychology. It's like measuring the number of gym memberships sold and concluding that everyone in the city is fit. The membership is just a leading indicator of intention, not a measurement of outcome. And there is a lot as humans that we intend, that we aspire, and even genuinely in the moment believe we will do or complete, whereas in reality, we simply don't. So if traditional metrics measure the wrong things, what should we be measuring instead? This brings us to the framework we developed for making human factors visible. Our framework focuses on 4 domains of human factor measurement. Each domain addresses a different aspect of psychological readiness, and together They predict transformation success with significantly greater accuracy than traditional approaches. Let me walk you through each one. The first domain is behavioral readiness, which measures actual behavior patterns rather than stated intentions. Instead of asking people if they're ready for change, we observe whether their behaviors indicate readiness. So here are some specific indicators that we track. Workaround frequency, which tells us how often people are creating parallel processes that bypass the new systems. Workarounds are a reliable indicator of psychological resistance. When someone says they support the new system, but maintains their own spreadsheets just in case, they're demonstrating that their behavior hasn't actually changed. Feature depth versus feature breadth reveals whether people are using the full capabilities of new tools or only the minimum features required for compliance. The surface level adoption uses new tools to do exactly what old tools did. It suggests the psychological shift hasn't occurred. Proactive engagement versus reactive compliance shows whether people seek out information about the transformation or only engage when required. Someone who attends optional training sessions and asks questions in Teams meetings is behaviorally ready. Someone who does the minimum required is demonstrating resistance through what we call compliance theater. Help-seeking patterns indicate people who are asking for help and how often. Psychologically ready individuals are asking questions early and very publicly. Those experiencing resistance either don't ask or they ask privately because they don't want to appear incompetent. Behavioral readiness tells us what people are doing, but behavior doesn't happen in a vacuum. It happens within an emotional environment that either supports or undermines the change. Remember back to Elizabeth Stewart and I emphasizing the criticality of psychological safety in episode 7. That then now brings us to our second domain, psychological safety, which measures the emotional environment for change. Transformation requires people to acknowledge what they don't know. They can make mistakes while learning and admit when they're struggling. If the environment doesn't feel safe for these behaviors, people will hide their difficulties and they'll fake adoption. This also connects directly to episode 7, where Elizabeth and I talked about vulnerability being essential for transformation. Question frequency in meetings is a powerful indicator. In psychologically safe environments, people ask questions publicly. When question frequency drops, it often indicates that people don't feel safe revealing what they don't understand. Error reporting rates tell us whether mistakes are being reported promptly or whether people are hiding errors until they become too big to conceal. A decrease in error reporting during transformation often means people are afraid of the consequences of admitting they're struggling with the new systems. Peer support dynamics reveal whether team members are helping each other or competing to appear competent. Psychologically safe teams share tips, they troubleshoot together, and openly discuss challenges. Unsafe teams keep the struggles very private. Feedback quality matters as well. When people provide specific, constructive feedback about transformation challenges, it indicates psychological safety. When feedback becomes vague or disappears entirely, people don't feel safe about being honest and talking about the problems they're experiencing. Behavioral readiness and psychological safety tell us about current state issues, but transformation is a process that unfolds over time. So we also need to understand the trajectory of change. The third domain is adoption velocity. Adoption velocity measures the speed and quality of behavioral change over time. This domain helps identify whether people are genuinely progressing towards new behaviors or stuck in patterns of resistance. This includes learning curve progression, which determines whether people are improving at a normal rate or showing signs of stalled development. Where you see stalled learning curves, they often indicate psychological barriers that training simply can't address. Remember from episode 9 when I talked about cognitive resources being depleted. Learning capacity diminishes as a result, regardless of training quality. Another factor, early adopter identification. It matters because in every organization, some people embrace change naturally. Identifying these early adopters and understanding their characteristics helps predict who else is likely to adopt and who will need some additional support. Another factor, influence network activation, which tracks whether the early adopters are influencing each other. Transformation spreads through social networks. If early adopters aren't bringing their colleagues along, something is blocking the natural diffusion of the new behaviors. Another factor, regressive patterns. They reveal whether people who adopted new behaviors are reverting to old ones under stress. Regression is one of the most reliable indicators of insufficient psychological readiness. The behavior changed temporarily, but underlying psychology didn't shift enough to sustain it. This brings us then to the ultimate question. Are changes actually sticking? Are they becoming part of how your organization operates? Or will they fade when attention moves elsewhere? Let's talk about domain 4, sustainability indicators. Sustainability indicators measure whether behavior changes are becoming embedded habits or remaining fragile conscious efforts that will fade when leadership focuses on other priorities. Much about what I am going to share requires active watching and listening of individuals across the organization. Yeah, system metrics help inform, but real listening becomes a superpower in determining if the organization and its culture has reached a level of sustainability with the transformation effort. Some examples here, habit formation metrics, which determine whether new behaviors are becoming automatic. Early in transformation, people have to consciously choose new behaviors. Successful transformation means those behaviors have become the default. Cultural integration measures whether new behaviors are becoming part of their team identity. When teams start describing themselves in terms of the new approach, rather than as people who used to work differently, the culture has shifted. Continuous improvement engagement, which looks at whether people are suggesting improvements to new processes or just complying with what they were told to do. Genuine adoption leads to ownership, and ownership leads to improvement suggestions. Next, stress test resilience examines what happens when the organization faces pressure. Do new behaviors persist, or do people revert to familiar patterns? The real test of transformation success isn't whether people can work differently when everything is calm. It's whether the new behaviors survive in the time-crunched adversity. These 4 domains, behavioral readiness, psychological safety, adoption velocity, and sustainability, work together to reveal what traditional metrics hide. Let me show you how this looks in practice by returning to the organization I mentioned in the opening. When we applied the 4 domains of human factor measurement to the organization where 82% survey support masked 31% actual adoption, here's what we discovered. In behavioral readiness, we found that 67% of employees had created personal workarounds that bypassed the new system. Feature usage analysis showed that 78% of the users were only accessing 3 basic features, despite the system having extensive capabilities that could transform their workflows. Help requests had dropped 40% since the transformation began, which initially looked like a positive sign until we realized it meant people had stopped trying to learn and were simply doing the minimum to appear compliant. In psychological safety, we found that question frequency in transformation-related meetings had dropped from an average of 8 questions per meeting to 2. Error reports had declined 60%, which leadership had initially interpreted as successful adoption. Well, in reality, people were hiding mistakes rather than reporting them. In interviews that we did with the teams, we discovered widespread fear of appearing incompetent in the new system. People were simply afraid to ask questions because they thought everyone else had already figured it out. In adoption velocity, learning curve analysis revealed that 45% of the employees had plateaued at basic proficiency. And it was within the first 2 weeks, and they hadn't improved since. So early adopters existed, but they became isolated. They weren't influencing their peers because the broader culture didn't show experimentation. The most concerning thing we found, a 28% regression rate among people who had initially shown strong adoption. When quarter end pressures hit, they reverted to familiar processes because the new behaviors weren't sufficiently embedded. They went right back to what was comfortable. In sustainability indicators, habit formation metrics showed that only 23% of employees were using the new system automatically. The rest were still consciously choosing between old and new approaches and choosing old more often than not. Cultural integration simply just hadn't occurred. Teams still describe themselves by their workflows. When asked about their work, they say things like, "We're the team that handles the quarterly reports," rather than describing their role in the new system. This data told a completely different story than the 82% survey support. But more importantly, it told us exactly what to address for the organization. The data allowed us to design an intervention that addressed the actual barriers, not the imagined ones. Instead of more training, which leadership had assumed was the solution, we focused on psychological safety and identity threat. We created peer learning pods where small groups could struggle together without judgment. We redesigned error reporting to celebrate learning rather than punish the reported mistakes. We worked with managers to shift their language from, "Are you using the new system?" to, "What are you learning as you work with the new system?" We helped early adopters become visible mentors rather than isolating them as experts. 6 months later, behavioral adoption had increased from 31% to 71%. Not because we train people better, but because we addressed the psychological barriers that made them unable to adopt what they already knew how to do. So, how do you start measuring human factors in your own organization? Let me give you a practical approach that you can implement immediately. First, audit your current metrics. List every transformation metric that you're currently tracking. For each one, ask, does this measure what people say or what they do? I can't stress this enough how important that determination is to any project success. Do your current metrics measure compliance or genuine capability change? You're likely to find that most of your metrics fall into the intention and compliance categories. That's not wrong, but it's way incomplete. Second, identify behavioral indicators for each domain. You don't need sophisticated measurement systems to start. Look for simple behavioral signals. In behavioral readiness, count workarounds and survey teams about parallel processes. In psychological safety, track question frequency in meetings and notice whether errors are being reported or hidden. In adoption velocity, identify your early adopters and ask whether they're influencing others. In sustainability, pay attention to what happens under pressure. Third, create baseline measurements before assuming you understand the current state. Measure the actual current state of human factors before launching any planned interventions. Most organizations don't do this, which means they can't tell whether their interventions are working or whether adoption was going to happen anyway. Fourth, triangulate data sources. No single metric tells the whole story. Use multiple indicators for each domain. Look for patterns across those particular chosen domains. When behavioral readiness, psychological safety, adoption velocity, and sustainability indicators all point in the same direction, you can become pretty confident in your assessment. Fifth, use measurement as intervention. The act of measuring human factors can itself change behavior. When people know that psychological safety is being tracked, managers pay more attention to it. When workarounds are being counted, people become more conscious of them. Measurement then isn't just about data. It's about signaling what the organization values. Everything I've described so far helps you measure human factors during transformation. But what about measuring readiness before a transformation begins? This is where you can prevent problems rather than just diagnosing them. The best time to understand psychological readiness is before you launch your initiative. Once transformation is underway, you're measuring resistance that already has formed. But if you can assess readiness in advance, you can address the barriers before they become entrenched in the culture. The understanding informs the plan, the activities, and yes, measures that become your hinge points to achieving your goals. At transformationassessment.com, we've built an assessment based on years of research and consulting experience. It measures the gap between stated intentions and likely behaviors. The assessment examines 5 dimensions of transformation readiness. The first, leadership alignment, measures whether your leadership team is genuinely unified around the change or fractured in ways that will create resistance. Next, capability readiness, which assesses whether people have the skills they need and feel confident in their ability to develop new ones. Next, cultural preparedness examines the psychological safety and openness to change in your organizational culture. Next, communication effectiveness, which determines whether your messaging is creating clarity or confusion. Next, engagement foundation, which measures the quality of relationships and trust that change will be built upon across the organization. What makes this assessment different from typical engagement surveys is that it's designed to reveal the gap between conscious support and unconscious readiness. The questions are structured to surface the psychological barriers that people can't self-report directly because they're not consciously aware of them. For leaders then planning their next initiative, the assessment provides the kind of pre-work that separates successful transformations from the 70% that fail. It helps you know where the psychological landmines are before you step on them. Take the assessment at transformationassessment.com. The measurement framework we discussed today, the 4 domains, the behavioral indicators, and the readiness assessment, represents a fundamentally different approach to understanding transformation. Instead of asking people what they think, we observe what they do. Instead of measuring compliance, we measure genuine psychological change. Let me leave you with this perspective. The gap between stated support and actual adoption isn't a communication failure or a training problem. It's a measurement problem. We've been measuring the wrong things, and then we're surprised when our green dashboards don't predict green outcomes. We know that traditional transformation metrics measure all of the wrong things. Surveys measure intention, not behavior. Training metrics measure compliance, not capability. Usage metrics measure access, not adoption. Milestone metrics measure project progress, not psychological readiness. We know that there's a gap between what people say versus what they do. The 4 domains of human factor measurement provide a more accurate picture. Behavioral readiness measures what people actually do, not what they say they'll do. Psychological safety measures whether the environment supports honest struggle and learning. Adoption velocity measures the speed and quality of behavior change over time. And sustainability indicators measure whether changes are becoming embedded habits. When you measure human factors instead of just activities, you can identify barriers before they become fatal. You can design interventions that address real problems, and you can predict transformation success with much greater accuracy. In our next episode, I'm exploring a danger that threatens every successful organization. It's called drift. What happens when the very success that built your market position becomes the psychological barrier that prevents you from seeing where the market is heading? Do iconic companies like Blockbuster, Kodak, and BlackBerry fail not because of one catastrophic decision, but through thousands of small, seemingly reasonable choices that gradually pulled them away from their relevance? How do you recognize when your organization has shifted from actively steering to passively floating, becoming a passenger instead of a captain? Episode 11 then examines the four stages of organizational drift, the six human factors that enable it to take hold, and the strategic framework for building the awareness that prevents drift before it becomes fatal. If you found today's episode valuable, subscribe to the Human Factor podcast wherever you listen to podcasts. Leave a rating and a review. And share this episode with colleagues who are struggling to understand why their transformation metrics aren't predicting the outcomes that they expect. To explore these concepts further, visit 2040digital.com for the Change Leadership series and subscribe to my Ideas and Innovations newsletter on Substack. Until next time, remember, you can't transform an organization without transforming the humans in it. And you can't transform what you don't measure. And finally, transformation isn't about technology, it's about people. This has been the Human Factor Podcast. I'm Kevin Novak. Thanks for watching or listening.